Autopsy doctors. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's passing after you carried out the procedure? Story 1. In college, I took a figure drawing class, and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it, so he dragged us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us 2 cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions, of course, "Have you ever found anything weird in a body?" came up. The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person aside from medical history. They were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth, and to use extra discretion with him in particular and not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab was full of 20-year-olds, and so nobody recognized who he was. Unsure if the teacher even knew, but it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information aside from his lifestyle. He had illicit substance use and alcohol issues in his life, and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. Kid finds an actual rod that he had medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on illicit substances. They suspect it was done over 30 to 40 years prior to his passing. They removed it and kept it in the lab, I believe, to show their students as part of a section on under-the-table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. The most pressing question is, how many drawings did you then do of men with raging boners? Edit. Thank you, kind stranger, for my first award. In the words of Spike Milligan, I'm not going to thank anybody because I did it all on my own. Actually, that class did have one model who was always semi-hard and had the largest nuts I have ever seen in my life. Just like 2 huge, gigantic hanging nuts. He'd also look you in the eyes when you were drawing them. I still run into him around town and am very thankful he doesn't recognize me. We had a more subtle version of this dude in my class. Before I took it, I'd always see the drawings of him hung up in the hallways outside of the life drawing studio, and I kind of wondered if the whole class had conspired to give the model a confidence boost or something. Took the class next semester, and I immediately recognized the model in person when he came in. Tiny, maybe 5'5", skinny elderly man, gray hair, probably 75-ish, enormous member. He didn't stare at me, but he definitely took a lot of poses with his legs open. I think that's why you probably see more female life drawing models than you do male ones, just because of the equipment being more on the outside. And as far as that class keeping that rod, did they keep other trophies from other cadavers? Story 2. Masters in Forensic Pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't pass from. I saw an older guy who died of pneumonia in the hospital. On autopsy, the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in his brain. Another guy in his around 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain, then perished shortly after. Passed of a heart attack, but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances, though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown-out skull, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck, and into the chest. That was pretty wild. It's so wild to me how on the one side humans can be so resilient and survive horrible things, and on the other side, just how fragile and quick life can be taken from us. Two very different extremes. Thanks for sharing your perspective. There's some people out there drinking at least a fifth a day, going to work living a seemingly normal life otherwise. Then you have someone else stub their toe and pass away of an infection. Edit. Today I learned how several famous people passed away. R.I.P. Bob Marley. Edit 2. I get it. He died of cancer that was found in his toe. I looked it up because people just kept saying R.I.P. Bob Marley. Didn't mean to imply he specifically perished from stubbing his toe. Personally been there. Close to half a gallon of vodka a day. It's normal after a while. Just keep the same routine. You never sober up. It's just who you are. Surprisingly, not unalive and almost 6 months sober. Thankfully, I haven't stubbed my toe either. Thank you for all your encouragement. It's awesome to have so much support. Congratulations to those who have been sober for a while and those just starting out. It's hell, but it does get better. I'm rooting for you too. The sequel. You folks are just completely awesome. In such an awful time in the world, this has really made me happy. I did a little drinking maybe decades ago, and I guess I'm just too cheap. I always drank because someone else paid, and it happened to be on a regular basis. But I do have a kind of addictive personality, so thankfully my addictions go to things like video games. So thankfully I never got caught up in that. I realize I'm lucky. Story 3. While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe head trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissors or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did the exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised, as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head, and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden, the person was a crime scene, and they had to call the police again and leave the person as untouched as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been an unaliving. How do you miss a gunshot wound to the head? Edit. And if the person did commit self-unaliving by gun, then the gun would be in the body, right? Like an unalive person with a gun in their hand isn't a clue at all? Second edit. Obviously, the question is rhetorical. Stop asking me if I'm blind to the poor quality of police. Now that's a dad joke. Small caliber guns don't always have a huge exit wound. In fact, sometimes they just bounce around inside and stay there. That's kind of awful. You don't think about anything ricocheting. You just think of it passing through or get lodged, if you think about anything like that at all. It kind of makes me wary of any kind of feelings inclining towards that if I ever get depressed. It's kind of awful to think about that happening. Story 4. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter, we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift genital ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The member was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely, his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He didn't survive much longer than that. Edit. I remembered another one. In my final year of training, we had a cadaver lab to practice advanced airway management techniques, e.g., difficult intubation, cricothyroidotomy, etc. While I was helping an intern do a basic intubation, she commented the tube wouldn't pass. I think she has some kind of growth or mass in her airway. I took a look, asked for some forceps, and pulled a half-eaten hot dog out of her larynx. It, of course, had been embalmed along with the rest of her. Cause of terminating identified. Oh wow, this one is terrible. Poor person. That must have been excruciating. Think of the internal and mental anguish you have to be under to take that type of pain without desperately seeking out help. Either this person had an incredible tolerance for pain due to life circumstances, or felt that even in pain, no one would take care of him, and they didn't deserve to be taken care of. Absolutely tragic. Edit. This thread is in response to the homeless man in the first story. Or even worse, he may have been mentally handicapped and unable to seek help for himself. Story 5. My wife is a pathologist assistant and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that perished minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity, and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhaging everywhere. During the difficult delivery, the resident used too much force with the forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver causes the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about the autopsy up to this point, but now has no interest. Oh, could you imagine finally carrying to term just to have one of the medical staff make a mistake like that? I'm going to count myself lucky I was only scalped when I was born. The doctor was furious at my mother for inconveniently going into labor an hour before the scheduled end of his shift and the golf game he had scheduled an hour later. He rushed the whole thing, doing a lot of damage to my mom in the process. He cut too far, grabbed my head with metal forceps and pulled so hard and abruptly that his grip slipped and he pulled all the skin off the top of my head. 40+ years later and I still have scars on my scalp that make hairdressers recoil in horror. Tell me that doctor got some trouble over that. Please. Lie if you have to. Story 6. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claims she perished after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job because it was so taxing mentally. The sad part about this is that babies sometimes just cry. There's nothing wrong with them. They're tired and just can't sleep. It's common for hospitals to specifically warn new parents not to shake their babies because sleep-deprived parents with colicky babies are sometimes driven to do that out of desperation. But I have never heard them having to warn specifically about slamming your baby into a wall. My wife had to watch 3 videos before being discharged with our first baby. Basically, all different ways of showing that it's okay to place the baby in a safe place for 5 or so minutes to regain composure. It's better to leave them in a pack and play unattended for 5 minutes than to continue holding a screaming baby and lose your cool. But yeah, sometimes babies just cry for no reason than to cry. It's hard. Wasn't expecting to have any baby stories in here, let alone 2 baby stories in a row. We're just so fragile, especially when we first start out, and hopefully one of the things that protects us are our parents. Hopefully. Story 7. Not a doctor, but a whole-body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. A mid-30s female went to the medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus and found a condom full of pills. Similar to most, the body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec. Easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. My theory is she was going to start carrying illicit substances that way, but wanted to practice with something that wouldn't unalive her first. This is actually a really good theory that I never thought about. It would explain a lot. Though she appeared to be a heavy substance user, I figured she'd have some amount of street knowledge. My immediate thought, too, I guess she wanted to do a dry run on a substance route to see if she'd be able to get through without having any risk of being convicted if she was caught. Story 8. Sheep farmer. I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something perishes to know if it's something that could spread. Had a ewe fall over unalive after losing a ton of weight and after treating her for everything under the sun. She would gasp for air and struggle to breathe, but antibiotics, steroids, and anti-inflammatory pharmaceuticals didn't touch it. She finally passed away, and I cut her open to see what the hell happened, fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with trash. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life, and it didn't unalive her until she was 2. Poor baby. I'm a range manager, and at the end of season, ranchers submit an end-of-season report that basically says how many, what dates, and what pastures, and number unalive and from what. The sheep ranchers have just so many more perishings. I swear, sheep want to perish. Definitely modern breeding and domestication practices have contributed to that. We raise a primitive breed of sheep which we found much more durable, but their commercial potential is of course much reduced from that perspective, i.e. not a good solution for your ranchers. But it is nice that they're self-lambing and not prone to fly strike or hoof rot.
Please like and subscribe if you made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 9. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night. Too many people during the day. One time it was really late, around 2 a.m. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones, and he saw the cadaver's arm move and twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again, proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. Next day, they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging, and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing his arm to twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. The professor did some digging. Literally. And now I know how I'm going to prank my funeral. My old martial art instructor was a policeman in the 80s. He was shot with birdshot in his torso and many of the pellets were not removed. He said that sometimes they make their way to the surface and he can just scratch them out. Story 10. I'm a veterinarian, and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals. And one of the more notable cases involved a prize Wagyu cow that perished mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call hardware disease. Apparently, the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally, the farmhands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip-ups do happen from time to time. Why are you eating that, dumb cow? That cow was pretty metal. Holy hell, I get freaked out when my cat finds a stray rubber band, like produce rubber band, and pukes up the chewed-up remnants. I can't imagine any creature eating metal wire. Story 11. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out, there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she perished in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they're made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. After my mother was cremated, my sister was curious and wanted to take a peek at her ashes inside the urn. She opened it and said, "Oh, right on top of these fine ashes was the hardware from the broken ankle repair she had gotten years before. You know, those ashes are only fine because they're ground up. Without that, you'd have chunks of bone. My friend passed away in college, and the mom wouldn't grind his ashes. so she gave a bunch of us some of his bones. I still have them, and it's been over 20 years. Story 12. I took forensic lectures, so I saw quite a bit of crazy stuff. But the thing that sticks out is an autopsy revealing a history of abuse, pain, and violence. A little more funny, a skeleton was found in the near mountains. It was very clear he perished in an accident 20-plus years ago. However, he had to be identified via DNA. Turns out his dad was not his dad, but his uncle. Sparked a whole public family drama show, because the family was well known in my area. It's an Arrested Development, isn't it? Since George Sr. and Oscar are identical twins, wouldn't a DNA test be useless in Buster's case? Edit. Words. We found your son that went missing 2 days ago. Also, your wife cheated on you with your brother. Story 13. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had perished in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeons and medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Last casualty of the Vietnam War. This was actually in the 90s, a bit before I was born. Actually, this does make me wonder if there's a possibility for other Vietnam veterans or Korean War veterans to possibly have a similar situation or straight-up lead poisoning. Or in the future, if there's a chance for this to happen to Iraq or Afghanistan veterans. Story 14. Forensic pathologist here. 2 come to mind. I had just moved back to my home state where my family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related, but before she texted back, I pulled the sheet back and already knew. He looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire unaliving. On exam, he got multiple textbook stab and incised wounds. I spent the next 30 minutes getting gaslighted by PD about, "Are you sure?" because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. Unfun fact, fire is not an uncommon way for people to try and conceal a self-unaliving. Not gonna lie. Extremely curious how someone could probe a forensic pathologist about if they really thought these were stab wounds, let alone for 30 minutes. Are you certain the fire didn't stab him? Seeing a cadaver that looks like an older you sounds like a Twilight Zone premise. Story 15. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. Then they did a whole scan, X-ray or CT, of the upper chest, abdomen, and pelvis. No bullet. At that point, someone said, "Curse it, let me scan the whole body." Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa, area behind the knee. It had traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. How the hell does a bullet even fit inside a blood vessel? Arteries are thick. They'd be able to fit a bullet. Regular veins and blood vessels wouldn't. Story 16. I am a pre-med student, and one time while shadowing a forensic pathologist, 3 days before Christmas, he was doing an autopsy on an automobile versus pedestrian accident. The man's face was completely smashed in. When they take samples of the brain, they cut the skin, pull it over the face, and then cut off the top of the skull. When they did that, the skull was basically shattered and bone fragments pulled back with the skin, and when they cut off the skull cap, the brain was obviously damaged and the eyeballs had been pushed back and fallen through the orbits and into the cranial cavity. The guy also had $10,000 in cash in his jean pockets. According to police, he had a record involving illicit substances, so the theory was either a drug deal gone bad or he stumbled into the road while under the influence. What did you do with the $9,000 in cash? The usual protocol is to report the $8,000 to the police, I think. Incorrect. You report the $7,000 immediately after finding it. Story 17. My high school senior teacher was a coroner or whatever, and one day was asked to perform an autopsy on a little girl who was shot by a shotgun. He quit on the spot. He was an absolutely fantastic teacher. Someone close to me worked in refrigeration and was called to go to a working morgue room. where bodies were on racks, not in wall units, where the fridge unit was loud and was told the bodies would all be covered. He went there, and most were not covered, and many had stained sheets on them. He mustered up enough guts to get to the buzzing refrigerator unit on the ceiling. He then noticed a small wheeled table with uncovered parts on it. It ended up being a baby cut into pieces. He noped the F out after that. Story 18. I heard a story once about a guy who perished, and completely unrelated to the main complaint during the autopsy, they found a grapefruit in his anus. Apparently, it had just been there the whole time. My uncle is an ER doc and said like 10% of all ER visits are people shoving things up their butt. My brother has been working at the ER during the COVID-19 heights 2 months ago. He said that most normal injuries have gone way back. Stuff like kids on bikes, car accidents, etc., but all the butt stuff was just as always. The people working there have a saying that goes something like, "The sigmoid colon is the bane of the perverts. I slipped and fell on the spatula while cleaning my kitchen naked." Story 19. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman was found unalive by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs, dissected everything. Completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as the last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom, a giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Expired, choking on dinner. I'm single, and happy being single, and honestly, I think about that scenario too often. Choking on my food, perishing alone in my apartment, my cat eating my face. Story 20. I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had perished from an OD on Walter White crystals. Well, we started the autopsy, and I went to cut his lungs out, and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth, and it was full of blueberry muffin mix, and it was in my throat. Turns out he just got high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix, and he ended up choking to expiration. I initially misread this as you put your finger in your own mouth to verify that it was blueberry muffin mix, and I gagged. Story 21. I did the autopsy of both the robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back while he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both perished from exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebrae shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.